The alarm on my wrist pulsed twice before I even reached the east corridor, and I already knew something was wrong. The state dinner had started 12 minutes ago, and the one person who mattered most at that table was missing. My name is Daniel Foss, and I was the only human allowed inside the inner court of the Velmiri Empire. Not because I was special, because I was useful. I could speak their language, read their customs, and somehow, without trying, I had become the one person the guards trusted to walk these halls alone at night. I turned the corner fast, boots echoing against stone that had been polished for 1,000 years, and I heard nothing, no voices, no light chimes, just silence where a prince should have been sitting beside his family. I pushed open the side door to the private garden, and there he was. Prince Kalor sat alone on a stone bench, his back straight, his hands folded in his lap like a man waiting for a verdict. His eyes, pale and clouded since birth, stared at nothing. He didn't turn when I entered. He didn't need to. On this world, sight wasn't the only way to know someone was near. "You're late for dinner," I said, keeping my voice calm, even though my heart was still hammering from the sprint across the palace. "I am not late," he said quietly. "I simply did not go." That sentence hit harder than it should have, because I understood exactly why. The Velmiri did not eat like humans. Every dish at their table was announced through light signals, pulses of color that rippled across the walls and across each other's skin, telling every guest what was safe, what was an honor, what was a test of trust. It was beautiful, it was intricate, and it was completely invisible to a prince who had been blind since the day he was born. "They forgot the translator lights again," I said. It wasn't a question. Kalor's jaw tightened. They did not forget. "There is no translator for what I cannot see. There has never been one. My family speaks a language of light at every meal of my life, and I have eaten in silence beside them for 18 years, guessing what is on my plate, waiting for someone to notice I am starving in more ways than one." I sat down next to him without asking permission, which was against about 6 different rules of court etiquette. I didn't care. "I have food," I said. "Simple food. No lights, no signals. Want to try it?" He turned his head toward me slowly, like he wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. "You would eat with me? Here? Now? Without ceremony? Where I'm from? That's kind of the whole point of eating with someone." I pulled the small ration case from my jacket, the one I carried on long shifts when the palace kitchens were too complicated to deal with. Flatbread, dried fruit, a strip of seasoned protein, a small container of honey. Nothing fancy, nothing that needed a ritual. "This is bread," I said, placing a piece in his open palm. "It's soft in the middle, a little crisp on the edge. Not hot, not cold. Safe to eat with your fingers." He held it for a moment, turning it slightly, feeling the texture before he took a bite. I watched something shift in his face. Not surprise exactly. Relief. "No one has ever described my food to me before," he said softly. "They simply expect me to know." "That's ridiculous," I said, and I meant it. How is anyone supposed to know something nobody tells them? I am supposed to sense it, through the light, through the customs bred into every Velmiri child before birth. I was born without the ability to see color, so the assumption became that I did not need the same courtesies as everyone else. My family stopped trying to include me when I was very young. It was easier for them to let the tradition continue without adjustment than to change it for one prince. I passed him the dried fruit next. "This one's sweet, a little chewy. Careful. There's a small seed near the center sometimes, so go slow on the first bite." He laughed. It was short, surprised, like the sound had escaped before he could stop it. "You are warning me about a seed." "Yeah? Is that strange?" "No one warns me about anything anymore. They assume I will simply figure it out, or they assume it does not matter if I do not." That answer stayed with me the entire meal. Every time I handed him something, I told him what it was, how hot it was, whether it needed 2 hands or 1, whether it was sharp on one side. It wasn't a performance. It was just how I ate with anyone who couldn't see their food, whether that was a sick friend back home, or my grandmother in her last years, when her eyes had failed long before the rest of her did. "Humans do this often?" Kalor asked, holding the last piece of protein carefully in both hands like it was something precious. "All the time. We feed our old people this way, our sick people, our blind people. It's not special. It's just decent." On my world, it would be considered special. It would be considered rare enough to be remembered. "Then maybe your world needs to update its customs." He went quiet for a moment, chewing slowly, and I let the silence sit there instead of rushing to fill it. The garden around us smelled like something sweet and unfamiliar, and somewhere above us, 2 moons hung low and pale against a purple sky. It should have felt strange, sitting there with an alien prince, sharing rations meant for long shifts and empty corridors. Instead, it felt like exactly where I was supposed to be. "Why did you come looking for me tonight?" he asked. "You are not assigned to my protection detail. I noticed you weren't at the table. Figured someone should check. No one else checked. I know. That's why I did." He turned his face toward me again, and for the first time since I'd met him months ago during a diplomatic briefing, he looked less like a prince performing composure and more like a young man who had simply been tired of being alone. "You did not ask permission to sit with me," he said. "You did not wait for an invitation. You did not perform the greeting ritual. You simply arrived, and you simply stayed. Was that wrong?" It was unfamiliar, and it was the first time in a very long while that I did not feel like an obligation someone was managing. I didn't know what to say to that, so I handed him the last of the honey instead, letting him taste it straight off my finger, the way I would with a kid too young to hold a spoon steady. And he laughed again, more freely this time, and for a few minutes it felt like we weren't in a palace at all. Just 2 people, sharing a meal, talking about nothing important. That was when the doors opened behind us. I heard the sharp intake of breath before I even turned around. Guards, court attendants. And behind them, moving with the slow, deliberate weight of royalty, the king and queen of Valmiri themselves, along with 2 of Kalor's older siblings, their expressions frozen somewhere between confusion and disbelief. The king's light pattern flared across his shoulders, a sharp burst of color that I had learned meant alarm, though I couldn't read the finer details the way a Valmiri could. The queen's hand rose to her mouth. Kalor straightened immediately, the ease draining out of his posture, replaced by the practiced stillness of a prince who had spent his whole life being watched and rarely being seen. "Kalor," the king said, his voice low and controlled in the way that told me he was furious and trying very hard not to show it in front of an outsider. "You are eating, with the human, without ceremony, without announcement, without permission." "I did not require permission to eat, Father," Kalor said, and his voice, though quiet, did not shake. "I required someone willing to sit with me." The silence that followed was heavier than anything I had felt in that palace before. The queen stepped forward first, her eyes moving between her son and the empty ration wrappers scattered on the bench, evidence of a meal that had clearly involved laughter, ease, and something that looked disturbingly like happiness. "You are smiling," she said, almost to herself. "I do not remember the last time I saw you smile at a meal." "That is because there has never been a meal where I did not have to guess, Mother," Kalor said. "Every dinner in this palace is a performance I cannot see. Every dish is a message written in light I was born without the ability to read. I have sat beside you my entire life, and I have never once known what I was eating unless someone accidentally told me." The king's shoulders stiffened. "The customs of our meals are sacred. They have existed for generations. And they have excluded me for 18 years, Kalor said, his voice rising now, steady but certain. "You built an empire of light and color, and you never once asked what that meant for the one child who could not see either." I stayed quiet, feeling every eye in the room shift toward me at some point during that exchange, but I didn't move. This wasn't my moment to speak. This was his. "He did not ask me to change anything for him," the king said, gesturing toward me, his tone somewhere between accusation and confusion. "He simply sat with you." "Yes," Kalor said. "He simply sat with me. He told me what was hot, what was sharp, what was safe. He did not perform a ritual. He did not require me to already know. He treated me like someone worth explaining things to, instead of someone expected to already understand." The queen's eyes were shining now, and I realized, with a small shock, that she was fighting back tears in front of her entire court. "We built rules to honor our guests," she said softly. "We never thought to ask if those rules honored our own son." "You didn't," Kalor said, and there was no anger in it now, just tired honesty. "Not because you meant to hurt me, but because it was easier not to look closely at what my blindness meant for how you lived your lives. It was easier to let the tradition continue exactly as it always had, rather than adjust it for one prince who could not see the light everyone else took for granted." The king was silent for a long moment, and I watched something complicated move across his face, something between shame and the slow, painful process of understanding. "How did you know to feed him this way?" the king finally asked me directly, his gaze sharp and searching, without light, without ceremony. How did a human know what generations of Valmiri tradition failed to consider? I thought about how to answer that honestly, without making it sound like I was lecturing a king in his own palace. "Where I come from," I said, "we don't have one single way of sensing the world. Some people see, some people don't. Some people hear everything, some people hear nothing at all. We learned a long time ago that if you want to share something with someone, you don't wait for them to already understand it your way. You just tell them, plainly, kindly. You say, 'This is hot, be careful.' You say, 'This is sweet, you'll like it.' You say, 'Here, let me help you find the edge of the plate.' It's not a special skill, it's just what you do when you care about the person sitting next to you." "That is all?" the Queen asked, almost disbelieving. "No formal training? No royal protocol for how to accommodate a blind child?" "No," I said. "Just paying attention, that's it." The king looked at his son for a long moment, and something in his rigid posture finally softened, the light pattern across his shoulders shifting from the sharp burst of alarm into something slower, calmer. 18 years, he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else in the room. 18 years, and it took a stranger from another world to do what none of us thought to do. "It is not too late," Kaler said, and there was something hopeful in his voice now, something that hadn't been there when I first found him alone on that bench. "It was never about grand gestures, Father. It was about someone simply choosing to explain the world to me instead of expecting me to already know it." The Queen crossed the garden and sat down on the other side of her son, something she had clearly not done in a very long time based on how carefully, how tentatively she moved. She picked up one of the last pieces of dried fruit from the wrapper on the bench. "Tell me what this feels like," she said softly. "Describe it to me the way the human described it to you." Kaler turned toward her voice, surprise clear on his face. "You want me to teach you how he taught me? I want to understand what my son has been missing," she said. "And if a stranger can learn to do this in one evening, then surely his own family can learn to do it for the rest of his life." I watched the prince take his mother's hand and place the small piece of fruit in her palm, guiding her fingers the way I had guided his only minutes before, and something in my chest tightened in a way I hadn't expected. This wasn't my story to be the center of anymore. It had become something bigger, something that belonged entirely to this family, finally seeing each other clearly for the first time in a very long while. The king approached slowly and knelt beside the bench, an act that stunned every guard and attendant standing in that garden, because kings did not kneel in front of anyone, let alone in front of a human aide holding an empty ration case. "I am told humans have a custom," the king said, looking at me directly. "A gesture of gratitude when someone has done something that cannot easily be repaid. A thank you usually does the job," I said. And a few of the guards actually laughed quietly at that, breaking the tension that had filled the garden only minutes before. "Then thank you," the king said, and his voice carried a weight that told me this wasn't a formality. "You did not come here to change our customs. You did not come here to challenge our traditions. You simply chose to sit with my son when the rest of us did not. And in doing so, you showed us something about ourselves that generations of ritual never could." Kaler reached out, and I realized he was searching for my hand, so I gave it to him, and he held it firmly for a moment. "Will you eat with me again?" he asked. "Not because my family requires it. Because I would like it." "Any time," I said. "No lights required." He smiled, and this time the whole garden seemed to notice it. The guards, the attendants, the king and queen, all watching a prince smile freely, for what felt like the first time in his life. Later that night, after the king and queen had returned inside, after the guards had resumed their quiet posts along the corridor, Kaler and I sat together in the garden a while longer, the two moons still hanging low above us. "They will change the customs now," he said. "I can feel it. My mother has already asked the court historians to begin recording alternative rituals for meals, ones that do not depend solely on light." "That's good," I said. "That's really good." "It should not have taken this long," he said, and there was no bitterness in it, just quiet reflection. "But I suppose some things only change when someone is willing to sit down first, without waiting for permission." "That's kind of a human specialty," I said. "We're not always the smartest people in the room. We don't always have the most advanced technology or the oldest traditions. But we've spent a long time learning how to take care of each other, even when it's inconvenient, even when there's no ritual telling us how. I think that is a rare gift," Kaler said. "Rarer than anything my empire has built in 1,000 years of light and color." We sat there a while longer, not saying much, just listening to the quiet sounds of the garden, the distant hum of the palace settling into night. And I remember thinking, as I finally stood to leave, that this was exactly why I had wanted this posting in the first place. Not for the diplomacy, not for the history books, For moments like this one, where something small, something as simple as sharing a meal and explaining what was on someone's plate, could end up changing an entire family, and maybe, in time, an entire world. Kaylor stood as well, steady now in a way he hadn't been when I first found him alone on that bench, and he offered his hand once more, not in the formal Velmiri greeting, but in the plain, simple way I had taught him earlier that evening. I took it, and we shook hands like two people who had shared something honest, something that didn't need a ritual to be understood. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked. "Same time tomorrow," I said. And as I walked back through the quiet palace halls, past the sleeping guards and the dimmed light signals along the walls, I found myself smiling too, because somewhere behind me, for the first time in 18 years, a blind prince was no longer eating alone.